Okay. So we should be live. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to do a DockerConEU kind of recap today. I think it was 2 weeks ago that the conference was hosted in Barcelona. So lots of keynotes, lots of talks, lots of sessions, trainings, you name it. I was there, probably too much to talk about. But yeah, we're gonna go through it. Joining me is Bret Fisher, a fellow Docker captain, also this year voted as the tip of the hat captain, like for his special achievement in teaching the people what Docker is and how to use it. So Bret, welcome. Thank you for joining me and doing this live thing. So maybe if you can introduce yourself for the few people that don't know you.
Well, thanks, Nils. I am fully festive in the office here. I've got a bunch of gift wrapping paper and lights, and my special holiday mug this year is not actually Rudolph. It's unfortunate. I wish it was Rudolph. I need to paint his nose red. But my name is Bret, and this is us talking on the internet about Docker and DevOps and all of the fun stuff we did at DockerCon. I do all things Docker, and I talk about containers in general and DevOps practices, and I've been doing that for a long time. So yeah, actually, you're right. I did win an award at DockerCon. Very excited about that. It actually is sitting over on the shelf over there. It's glass, so it's kind of hard to see in the background. But yeah, that was a big honor, and to be on stage in front of 2,500 people was nerve-wracking to say the least. So I'm glad they didn't ask me to have a speech, because I wouldn't have said anything intelligent.
Yeah, because you were unaware of getting the award, right?
I was. It was a well-kept secret, and lots of deception went into making sure that I didn't know what was going on. But yeah, it was that. I mean, hopefully we do that every year, because that was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to someone else joining that club and getting up on stage in front of the audience, because we don't all get a lot of chances to stand in front of 2,500 people, and it's, even if you're just standing there waving your hands, it's kind of a rush kind of thing to do, and it's a rare thing that not a lot of people get to do. So I think it's pretty fun to let them have because the community winners, we had community award winners from the community leadership group, people that run meetups like yourself and myself, and those people won awards. One of our friends, Mike Irving from Virginia, won one of the awards, and very excited for him and the other community leaders. So in case you're interested in running a Docker meetup in your city, you could win an award at DockerCon.
Yeah. They don't fly you out though, but anyway, you can have the award
if you're there.
Yeah. Actually, it's already a good topic, I guess, to get started with the whole captains, community leaders, stuff like that. I did have the feeling, I guess, the DockerCon San Francisco this year, so earlier this year, April, May, I can't recall what exact month. But back then, I can't recall seeing anything about, community or meetups, captains, contributors during any of the keynotes. And now they resurfaced it back. So that's, in my opinion, a good thing, because I, at one point, had the feeling like, why are these people not acknowledged? Like, this is what makes the word Docker go around. So I think they kind of got that message and did something about it. So that's definitely a good thing. They're not getting I think we already discussed that in an earlier live stream that I did on your channel, that maybe in our echo chamber we always we know Docker, and we know that the people we know Docker, but there's still a large chunk of people in IT, just to name it general, that are unaware of what containers are, what Docker is. So there's still a huge land grab to be done of people who are unaware of this beauty of what Docker and containers and the entire ecosystem is. So I don't know if did you feel the same way, or is it just me that kind of felt left out a couple of months ago, and now we're back in the game?
We're back in the game. The community is great again. Yeah, we I think that definitely. I mean, if you've been going to DockerCon long enough, you know, it has had so many different lives, right? Like the first few years that I didn't get to go, but I hear from people like yourself and others that were there in the earlier years that, you know, it was much more startup-y. It was the you know, it didn't matter what Docker did. Anything they announced was super exciting, and it was almost always open source. I mean, they didn't even have commercial products back then. So yeah, it was all open source, and they were just trying to figure things out. And then I don't know, 2016, I think was kind of the year, maybe 2017 was, you know, they announced Docker Enterprise. Back then it was called Docker Data Center. And so they were experimenting, trying to figure out products. And, you know, we started to see the inklings of Windows people showing up. So Windows sysadmins and Windows developers. But I think definitely in 2018, that's when like a huge amount of new people started showing up. And so I'm going to make this, I don't even have, you know, this anecdotal thing of maybe what's happening is the people that are startup people, you know, Silicon Valley, people that are early days, internet startups, tech companies that are already have been focused on containers for years, you know, maybe they have, not so many of them maybe are going to DockerCon anymore. Because like at this DockerCon, just like the one in San Francisco, a crap ton of people raised their hands when they said, is this your first DockerCon? So you can get really excited that there's all these new people at DockerCon, but you also have to realize that means if we didn't double the size of our audience, that means there's also a lot of people that aren't at DockerCon. And so I started to think about, you know, where are people going? I mean, maybe what's happening is the people that were early on and all the startup people, and we were all open source people, it got involved with at the beginning. That's how the captains program started, and the community programs was all out of the open source and community leading efforts. And those people are all just doing their thing, and they don't necessarily need a DockerCon every year, or, you know, every 6 months or whatever to get their fill of what Docker is doing. There's now an entire ecosystem of stuff that didn't even exist 6 years ago. When DockerCon started, DockerCon was kind of it. There wasn't another container conference that I'm aware of. So now we have a crap ton of container conferences. We've got container conferences all over the world at different companies, different, you know, we got KubeCon and Cloud Native, and now Linux Conference is doing stuff on their own and that has containers. And so now every other conference has container stuff in it. There's Docker stuff, there's Kubernetes stuff. So people don't have to go to DockerCon anymore. So now we see all these new people showing up, and those people are much more enterprise focused. You know, they've got a mixed workload of Linux or Windows, or maybe all Windows. And that's just a different vibe, right? Like those people are sometimes not even used to open source yet. They're still getting into open source, still not doing anything in open source themselves. Whereas maybe the early on people were more, you know, open source by default, maybe even contributors to open source. And the people I talk to now at the last, you know, 3 DockerCons, I think, I get a lot more Windows people that are not, you know, they're just in it for the business tools, not so much into it for the open source coolness of it all. And I think we saw that, like, to answer your question specifically, I think we saw that in DockerCon. I felt like last year EU was the first one where it was like all business announcements, all business products, very little to any open source conversations, very little to any community focused stuff. And I feel like that was a big shift because all of us that were in the community definitely felt that change of the conference. And that was really just, I think, the conference going where it needed to go, because that's where its audience was going and that's where the audience was coming from. But you're right. Now, a year later, it feels like we've kind of swung back a little bit and sort of found a happy medium where we can have both. You know, like, I feel like it was the business stuff on day 1 and it was the open source community stuff on day 2. How did you get that vibe of like they split up the days like that?
So if I can go back to one thing you said, indeed, I have a mutual feeling about a year ago, DockerConEU, which was then in Copenhagen, I think, where indeed it was lots of business, enterprise, like all those words. I even remember bringing 2 colleagues. Look, I'm not working for enterprise at all. We're purely open source. bringing to colleagues, telling them, sorry guys, I didn't know this was going to be the topics.
Right.
But there was the third day, I think, the Moby Summit. So Moby, for people who don't know, is kind of the umbrella they built for all the open source projects under Docker. So Docker is one big box of tooling that they started to rip apart, and then open sourcing a bunch of those components, and brought that under the Moby umbrella. I do have the feeling that currently that name is kind of, or never really caught on, maybe. Like that's at least what they try to force, as this is the open source part of it, and then Docker is more the enterprise. But I have the feeling that didn't really caught on. But anyway, you still had that third day of full-on open source, like nothing. Word enterprise wasn't used. Everything was open source. Then 6 months later ish, the Docker, the North American one in San Francisco, it seemed to be all enterprise. Like there wasn't even a summit around open source.
Right.
And now it feels like the pendulum is swinging a bit back and going a bit to the middle, like a bit of enterprise, some acknowledgement for the open source community. So I have the feeling they're still trying to find their way. But yeah, anyway, it's I guess indeed they have to they have to feel themselves what kind of audience they're attracting. So yeah, that was just a feeling of mine that the last couple of event or DockerCons have been really different, I have to say. Like the focus has been shifting a couple of times in just a year's time.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Docker people feel it as well, and I'm sure that's probably what's happening behind the scenes. It's not like people don't know what they're doing. It's like it's probably them trying to figure out what does our audience want, right? What do people, when in a world where there's 100 container conferences now that they started, what do you go to DockerCon for that you can only get at DockerCon? And for a lot of us, we keep saying that's the community. It's the people that you talk to there. I mean, there's so many things at DockerCon that I'm now starting to see at other conferences that I feel like we're very community focused. Like they have the Docker Pals, DockerCon Pals, where basically if you're new to the conference, there's someone who's been there a while, sometimes even a Docker captain that's a community leader, is going to help you navigate and get around, and you sort of have them as a buddy that you can meet up at because one of the things that sucks is I'm a freelancer, right? So a lot of times I'll go to conferences, and if I don't have any friends that are going there, I don't have coworkers going with me, and so I'll show up at like if I went to re:Invent, a gigantic conference like that with multiple hotels and everything, I would not be hanging out with friends unless I knew random people there from the community. And if that was true of me going to DockerCon, then I could use Docker Pals as a way to actually have at least one or two people that I have met at the beginning, and I'm able to see at different events and know who they are, at least remember their names, and feel like it's okay to just kind of crash their party and hang out with them, which I think is really cool. And it's a surprising now that I think about it, how many conferences don't do that, and that almost seems like a thing that all conferences should do, because there's nothing more intimidating than going to a conference with thousands of people and you don't know any of them, and you're maybe the only one your company can send. I know I used to work at a government agency, and one of the things we would do is to maximize our money on training is that everyone would go to one conference and then they'd come back and report to the rest of the team on what they learned from that conference. They almost had to do like their own training or briefing of what they learned. But that meant that they were going to a conference by themselves usually. And that can really stink. So anyway, DockerCon does all kinds of stuff like that. And I'm glad that they did the recognition of one of the pull request. Did you mention that? He's
no.
I think he's a Japanese contributor to the core, to Moby core, and they did the announcement. I think it was on day 2 of he added the SSH feature.
Oh right, yeah.
Ashudo or Ashido. I'm probably messing up his name. But evidently he's a very prolific, amazing contributor, open source in the community. I think he works for Telecom over there or something. And they put him on screen. Like, I mean, they didn't have him himself, but they celebrated him on screen saying, thank you for submitting this PR. And I was like, man, how cool would that be every DockerCon just to have, like, list the top 5, non-corporate maintainers that have submitted, cool bug fixes or cool features that aren't, aren't Docker. Basically.
Yeah, true. Because another thing in the same context is the Moby cool hacks. So that's something they didn't do this year. So usually, I think at the last day, even at the very end, like when all sessions are over, they still try to get everyone in the keynote room, and then I think they picked 3 or 5, can't recall, projects that were built around the Docker ecosystem. Like OpenFast from Alex, like the serverless thing. Was actually one of started as a hack and now he's working at VMware and really building it out as a software vendor. But that's another thing I'm kind of missing. Like they're not really giving a stage for these kind of little projects, and some of them start very little and then grow to be something really big because they get to be on stage, present for the thousands of people that are there. And if they're really something cool, then they might grow. Like even Play with Docker, I think, was also once presented there. So what's up with that? Like, weren't you missing that?
Yeah. I mean, they could always do. Well, to be fair, too. Well, is there a keynote in America DockerCon on day 3?
6 months ago.
Yeah, there was only 2 days.
Yeah. So there were cool hacks, but then that was the first time I started to feel like, okay, now they're making it weird because I think there were 3 hacks. Like one was from Google, which I mean, you knew like there's a whole team. Like this is not a simple hack. It's Google paying people to build this thing, so it's kind of a showcase for a project at Google. Then NASA. One project I can't recall, and then NASA was also big thing. But anyway, at least it was cool. Like it was something they sent into space, and it has Docker on it. I can't even recall anymore, but it has these nice, cool pictures and stuff. And then they always make the same joke, like a deploy for us, it takes 9 minutes or 9 hours or whatever to even get into space. So that. It's cool. I mean, it's probably also not a little hack that someone built in his basement. But anyway, that was a cool project. But the 2 others were a bit weird, felt crammed into that keynote or the cool hacks bit of the conference. So in my opinion, they should just bring it back and keep it community driven, like cool hacks coming from the community. It can be small, can be something built in a day, but at least showing off what you can build around Docker. That's I think they should bring that back.
Yeah, I think it's funny because it's almost like there's a bifurcating audience. We've got the open source community driven people that both love Docker, that because it was an open source tool, but they loved it because it solved their problems or it made things better, obviously, but they loved it even more because it was this open source community and tooling, and everyone was working to make it better together, and they're there for that, right? Then there's the other audience, the people that are now making money using Docker products and maybe paid products, and they're at the conference to learn about those products. And at the end of the day, they may not even care about open source or going to a meetup or whatever. They're just like, these are the products that I've chosen for my business platforms to run on, and I need to learn everything I can about them. And because I mean, I used to go to years and years and years of Microsoft conferences. There'd be 10 to 20,000 people there, and the word open source was never mentioned, except for back in the day, it was mentioned as like a competitor to Microsoft, right? And of course, Microsoft, like everyone else, has changed their tune, and that's totally different nowadays. But still, predominantly, you go to Microsoft conference, and most people there are there to learn a product and the tooling, not to even discuss open source or any of that stuff, you know. And still, so it's interesting. I feel like in that audience at DockerCon, we're starting to experiment with both audiences trying to be in the same place, which you don't normally get. If you think about most conferences are either a vendor conference, which means largely not open source, or a completely open source conference, like a Linux conference. O'Reilly Velocity is very open source oriented. You know, those kind of conferences, or any of the community conferences that tend to be much more open source than, and it's weird because I feel like DockerCon is in that unique place where it started as a community conference. Now it's a vendor conference, as really, and it's trying to do both. And I to put this sort of conversation to bed, I think it's really hard to do that. Like whatever they're doing, it's hard to serve both audiences. And some of us, we have a foot in both, right? We
of course
work on the business side. We also support the community side. So, but I think a lot of people don't. And trying to keep both those audiences happy, and to keep, you know, because honestly, I'm sure they want the audience to grow at the conferences. They want to make it bigger and bigger. But it seems like all the new people are coming from the business side. So that means they've got to put more business stuff in to make it justifiable for the business people. Yeah. So it's a weird transition. And the cool thing is we're a part of it. And we're part of, I think, defining it, right? As captains, we get the ability to give feedback. We get to control the community a little bit in terms of the message that we put out, like this video.
So to try to wrap it up, and I know this is not going to be an easy question, but if people ask me, should I go to DockerCon, yes or no? Well, like, or what kind of people, or who should go to DockerCon? Like,
right.
Like, again, like if someone from my team asks, should I go? Like, my answer is, I don't know. It's hard to say.
Well, what's interesting about DockerCon that I will, okay, so conferences in general, we should have Phil Estes on this show because I just saw him announce on Twitter that he's been to like 13 countries this year or something, like 30. Like, I thought I did a lot of travel this year, but I went to 2 O'Reilly Velocities. I went to a QCon at the end, not CubeCon, but a Q, the letter QCon at the end of last year. I went to what's one in Chicago? The one that Adam now works for, Trifork, Go-To conference. And then I went to other stuff, small community conferences and stuff like that. And I feel like we're actually, in a lot of these conferences, no longer talking about Docker 101. Even though every day there's people that need to learn containers and what they mean. A lot of these conferences that have been talking about containers for 3, 4, maybe 5 years are no longer talking about it at that base level. They're now talking about Kubernetes, like basically, what do you have to learn after containers? Like once you've learned basic containers, then you need to learn orchestration. You need to learn all the other tooling around it, you know, monitoring of containers, logging of containers. And so now when I go to the other conferences, for example, at O'Reilly Velocity, my talk was the only talk with the word Docker in it, but there was 33 talks with the word Kubernetes in it. And it wasn't because they didn't need to know containers, because Kubernetes runs on Docker. So they just maybe, I guess my guess is another, you know, me guessing at things situation. But I think the people that are at those conferences have largely learned containers, and the ones that are new to containers, if they're new to that conference, there's just not enough of them to warrant talks. And so my argument for who goes to DockerCon is if you're new to containers, because DockerCon still has the most Docker 101, you know, orchestration 101, basic stuff. They had workshops about all the 101 stuff. And of course, they have advanced sessions, the black belts and stuff like that. But I feel like it's now for 2 audiences I would recommend. One, if you're interested in Docker enterprise products, and if you're specifically interested in the Docker workflow, because I think definitely Docker has focused more on the developer to ops workflow, much more than a lot of other conferences do? And then secondly, are you someone who's new to containers and you need to understand the basics of containers? And I think that DockerCon is a good place for that. I actually had a conversation with the people that are running O'Reilly Velocity around what can I help do, because I've talked with them for years now. I've done talks and sessions and workshops for them for years. And, what are we going to talk about in 2019? And it basically we couldn't come up with a good way for me to do any Docker talks, because they felt like the Docker 101 wasn't big enough audience for them to justify a talk. And then they've already got so many people talking about Kubernetes that we really didn't need any more talking about Kubernetes. So I just kind of said, hey, okay, well, reach out if you want to talk about Swarm, or maybe like a compare orchestrators conversation, stuff like that. But it's interesting. It's an interesting little transition right now where we're definitely gonna need Docker 101 stuff forever, right? Just like we need React 101 or Web 101.
Yeah, and I think your courses, your online courses on Udemy, they're more popular than ever. So there's again still a huge land grab of people who have no clue about Docker, containers, orchestrators, and who are working in IT. Like when we hire for our team, people do have to build, like as an assignment for a few hours, build a small application. Like there's from all the ones we get in, and it's not a requirement or anything, but there's almost nobody like committing their ready application with a Docker file or Docker Compose or whatever. Like it's always a bunch of commands you have to run to set up their built application. So that always makes me wonder, like Docker, like they're using React, they're using Vue, whatever, all the hip stuff, but still Docker, or a way to easily set up, and to me that feels that it is Docker, to set up an application is still something lots of developers, new sysops people still haven't touched yet, and that's something I think we, Docker, and the whole ecosystem shouldn't forget. There's still a huge group of people that aren't aware of what we're always talking about. So
yeah. All right, so I have a thought. You have some demos of stuff that they did at DockerCon, but before that, I thought we would get to a couple of questions.
Yeah. I see some rolling in already. So
yeah, and it looks like we're not going to have time for all the questions. I really appreciate everyone in there asking questions, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'm going to just start from the top, and Samir has a bunch of questions. Let's see. In CI/CD Jenkins pipeline, do we spin up test pods in a Kubernetes cluster? I don't know. In Jenkins pipelines, I don't know. It depends on what you're trying to test, because I'm not sure that you would need Kubernetes. I mean, okay. So there's a multiple answers to that question. One of them is yes. One of them is no. If you do the Docker, the Jenkins Enterprise, as far as I know, Jenkins Enterprise now expects you to deploy it on Kubernetes. But what's happening there is Jenkins is controlling Kubernetes. So I'm not really sure. In other words, it's spinning up test runners inside of Kubernetes for you. So I'm not sure that you need to be manually telling Jenkins, like, here's my deployment, and I want you to create some pods. Like, I haven't actually done it in Kubernetes, but one of the other Docker captains, Laura Taco, actually is one of the engineering leads at the CloudBees, the company that runs Jenkins. And she's actually probably the better one to answer this. But I think her and I had a conversation about it. And the way I understand it is Jenkins running on Kubernetes, which they now give you all of the stuff you need to do that. I don't know if it's a paid only feature or if it's the Jenkins open source as well. But I think you let Jenkins do that, and you shouldn't have to worry about it. In other words, you're taking a Kubernetes cluster, you're deploying Jenkins on top of that, and then Jenkins controls Kubernetes for you, is what I think the answer is. the other answer I have is you don't necessarily need Kubernetes to just run Jenkins. Like, it depends on how big your Jenkins solution is. If you're trying, basically, don't make Jenkins harder than it needs to be. Right? It's already complicated enough. If you don't need a multi-server orchestrator to spin up that many kinds of Jenkins stuff, you can get away with a 2-server Jenkins solution or a single server Jenkins solution. You can do a lot of stuff. You don't necessarily need an orchestrator. I see people doing really advanced Jenkins stuff, and that's only usually in companies where, like, one of my clients, they have Windows stuff and they have Linux stuff, and they need to test multi-OS. They actually build Windows binaries and they test PHP and they do all this other stuff, and so they need an advanced cluster, but even they don't need a container orchestrator to do that. They just set up like 3 servers.
Yeah, what I'd like to add to that is, maybe I also don't understand the question fully, and it's a bit uneducated because I don't use Jenkins, or more of a Circle CI shop. But just in general, to test things or even to build things with Jenkins, like, you don't necessarily have to bring up an entire cluster. Just create a new namespace on your Kubernetes cluster, just for the building part. Or if you want to do tests, smoke tests, integration tests, all that sort of stuff. So you need some kind of, not mirroring of your production, but something that runs in kind of the same way of running environments, just within your already running cluster, having a separate namespace that's nicely sealed off of the rest of, especially of your production system, could be another solution. Again, it's more of an idea. I don't really know what your context is or what you're looking at, but that could be another way of looking at things, just hiding them under their own namespace.
Excellent point. Yeah, if you have a big enough cluster, you don't have to worry about your jobs interfering with your production workloads or whatever. So yeah. No. Great question. Let's see what's next. So let's answer a couple more, and then we're going to do some demos. Let's see. Hello, everyone.
It's funny to see how often, just by looking with a blind eye at it, like the word Kubernetes is in the chat already mentioned maybe 10 times.
Right.
So yeah, anyways,
yeah,
like, I mean, that's where I guess the market is going, and what we've seen earlier, and we see proof of that every day. But anyway, it's Kubernetes is at the top of mind of people currently.
Yeah, let's see. What are some of the main ways to debug issues in Linux Kubernetes? To debug issues. So I would say the answer to that is lots and lots of tools and lots of experience administrating servers, obviously Linux servers, and then especially understanding distributed application troubleshooting. So I would actually, if I was new to that, I would probably be Googling around distributed application troubleshooting more than I would container troubleshooting, because a lot of the tools that you use to troubleshoot any misbehaving, because what is Kubernetes? It's a distributed application running APIs over multiple servers. Like, so there's something you could probably look at called NetShoot, and I'll throw in a link. It's not what's interesting is it's not a tool itself. It is simply a container housing a crap ton of, that's actually a technical term, a crap ton of Linux tools. Troubleshooting. Yeah, NetShoot. It's actually created by one of the Docker engineers, and it continually gets better and better. But all it is, there's probably a couple of specific things in there that are maybe container specific, but almost all the tools in there are around just understanding Linux and TCP/IP networks and how to troubleshoot from one server to another, and troubleshooting networks themselves and making sure that the server is healthy and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
So I don't.
Again, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm done. Go.
I think it's indeed a pretty difficult answer to give if you don't know the context. But high level, I would say, first of all, it's not necessarily about the tools. I guess it's more about or first thinking about changing the mindset within your team or even your company. And then when I look at just purely based on my experience, because we also have a bunch of tools that monitor and different things of our entire infrastructure. But if I were to give an answer of what's the Pareto effect, the small thing that has had the most impact, I would definitely say, especially in a distributed world of applications and talking to each other, I think having a good system that pulls out logs from your applications and brings them into a central database, and typically that's I guess the typical solution is Elasticsearch. And maybe FluentD in between, or Logstash, so something that pulls the logs that your applications write to their log and their error output, pulling that out and then bringing it into a central database, again Elasticsearch. Maybe annotating with some things that you get from your orchestrator, like it's running on this server, it's this application, this version. So some annotation to those logs that you actually know, maybe it's just one particular container that is doing weird stuff, or it's the entire application that you know where to look. That, I think, for us is still making the most or bringing the most value. There are things that you cannot debug just purely based on logs, and then you need other tools. But I would say like 80% of the issues, just by looking at logs, or with Elasticsearch with a Kibana dashboard on top, you can, by pulling certain graphs, and it's a bit, you need to get a bit accustomed to it. And again, that's the whole mindset change. But by pulling some graphs, by doing some searches, generally we find our issues just by looking at the logs. And then sometimes it's deeper on the network, and then there's other tools like Linkerd that looks at how is literally one container talking to another one and what's going on over the network. There's tracing tools like Jaeger, for instance, I think that you can really install into your application, and that will even be able to say on this line of code something weird is going on. Like, for instance, a call to a database. In 9 out of 10 of the containers of application A, it takes 100 milliseconds to make a connection, but in 1 out of 10, it's taking a second. There's something wrong with this particular container. So those like nuances there, you need very specialized tools for. But again, the majority, again, in my experience, have been solved by just looking at logs and having a good mindset of writing good logs. Because you can write too much logs and then everything gets lost. You can write too little, so you don't really have a feeling what's going on. So it's not a clear-cut answer, but I would say if there's some part you want to start, first look at that and then expand. Okay, then you can start monitoring network and everything that's going on in your infrastructure and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm looking down the chat further. He's actually getting more specific and talking about Kube specifically. And then Oliver jumps in and says he loves the Visual Studio Code Kubernetes plugin for debugging purposes. And that's cool because I never thought to look for one in code. And it's funny because every time I do something, every time I open up a new file type in Kube or in Visual Studio Code, it bugs me at the bottom. It says, "Would you like to install this?" Because I open up a C file. Like, would you like to install this C++ plugin or whatever? And I think I ignore that because it's just like I'm like, no, I just want to edit the file. But that's cool. I didn't know about that. So yeah, Samir, check that out. The Visual Studio Code plugin. That's cool. I didn't know about that. I will definitely be checking that out later. Yeah, and then it's amazing. There was some report recently. Little side note: Visual Studio Code. Somebody did an analysis, and it is taking the world by storm. It's like the newest editor on the market of open source and paid tools. And it's quickly becoming the standard, surpassing Atom and other free and open source tools. So obviously, if you're a Vim or Emacs person and you're diehard on that, like there's no GUI tool that's going to convince you otherwise. But I switch back and forth nowadays between code and Vim, and I think it was a couple of years ago that I finally moved from Atom to Vim as my editor. If I was going to use a GUI, but I still happen to use Vim a lot of times. So I just put the Vim plugin in Visual Studio Code. So I get a lot of students actually that are very interested in Visual Studio Code and didn't know about it. So
yeah, I use it myself. Like I was pretty, I wouldn't say hardcore, but pretty much into Sublime for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And there's nothing particularly wrong with Sublime, but at one point I made the switch to VS Code to see how it works, and always stuck with that. So there must be something that makes me stick, but I can't really put a figure on what that is. But yeah, they did a good job at building a good editor. Who would have thought that the editor, the de facto editor, was going to come from Microsoft?
I know, right? That they were going to take essentially one of their paid developer tools and then make a free version of it that's so good that everyone wants to. I mean, I knew it was going to happen. I knew something was starting to happen when I saw a friend of mine who runs part of the JavaScript community, who's on a Mac and who has no Microsoft tools installed. I saw him give a presentation years ago, probably 3 years ago at least at this point, and he was using Visual Studio Code in his demo, and I was like, if he's using it, then there's something to this thing. Okay. Although I have to admit, Sublime still the best tool to open up a 1 meg log file.
Yeah, that's
its performance. You can't. I mean, I think even I mean, maybe not new Vim, but I don't know. It's probably been 2 or 3 years now. I remember I had to deal with a lot of big log files back then, and Sublime could deal with those log files faster than anything else, including Vim, because Vim was doing like inline text colorizing and stuff, and that really slowed it down. But then since then, they've gotten this whole background workers in Vim, and it's a little more this sort of client server model, and I think that's probably improved its performance. But anyway, nerd stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question, and then let's do some cool demos.
Well, actually, I want to segue into the topic of orchestration, which we already touched briefly on a couple of times. And I do see some question or discussion around it, like Swarm versus Kubernetes. The big battle, so it seems. Let's dive into that. So one of the demos I can give later on will be a bit more around Kubernetes, but I think the elephant in the room is also something we need to talk about, namely Swarm, because I see it mentioned here, like literally it's kind of dead, like literally paraphrasing the words. I went to a AWS meetup a couple of days ago where it was also some talk about orchestration and listing Kubernetes Nomad, and then someone said Swarm, and then someone else said it's dead. Let's talk about that, because obviously before the actual conference, the day before, we had a captain summit. So with all the captains in the room, and then at one point there's a bunch of product managers from Docker that we can ask questions to, and they can ask for feedback on their products. So we had a pretty lively discussion about Swarm, because I think the feeling from the captains also is that what's going on with this project, because it used to be all about Swarm as an orchestrator. Then Docker started, I think also a year ago, providing their support for Kubernetes, and was like, both can coexist. And then all the talk about Swarm is going down. But then when we asked that question and said, well, we still believe in Swarm as captains, because we still think it's, or many of us still think it's a much simpler solution than Kubernetes. And I mean, I love Kubernetes too. We use it in our team, and we specifically chose Kubernetes based on previous experience with Mesos. But one of the things we feel is that probably some part of the people using, or the companies, teams using Kubernetes probably don't need it and would be better off with a solution like Swarm, because it's much simpler, much easier to understand all the little components. So yeah, maybe you can tap into that, because I know, yeah, you even have a course around Docker Swarm. But I think, yeah, the whole idea of Docker Swarm is that should be killed, because it's not the case. Docker reassured us that they're still actively working on it, and they have, I don't know, like all their, or a large chunk of their enterprise clients are running on Swarm, if I remember well. So there is definitely activity, and we gave feedback on these are features missing in Swarm that probably could also bring people over, or at least, yeah, make it more like simple features that would make it so much better.
Yeah. It's something that I think we definitely need to get the word out on, because I think what's one of the things that I'm worried about right now, and this is one of the sort of soapboxes I get on and preach about, is that I feel like there's people that are perfectly happy with Swarm, right? It does the job, it has the features they need, and it works. And I get this question almost everywhere I talk, and every time I give a Swarm workshop or wherever, is Docker getting rid of Swarm? Or is Swarm going away, or is it irrelevant, or whatever? Because they're using it and like it, and they're not sure that they need Kubernetes in terms of the administrative overhead, in terms of the complexity. They just don't necessarily need all of that, so they're happy with where they're at, but they're worried that Swarm's somehow going away. And we have been asking Docker about that for 3 different DockerCons in a row, because the captain's program is largely people that are running or implementing container technology, and we see the value of both orchestrators, both Swarm and Kubernetes. We feel like they both belong in the community. They're both open source projects. You can technically run Swarm without Docker. You don't even need the Docker daemon if you're someone who wants to go to that level. But I'd say that 99.9% of the people I talk to don't really care. They just want to be productive, and they want to use easy tools that get the job done. If you get outside the bubble of those of us that live in the container ecosystem and talk about this stuff all day, mostly people just want to use a tool that they believe is going to be around in 3 years and that solves their problem, right? They're not so concerned with what's cool or what's trendy, or they're looking at stability and productivity, right? And we also have to realize that we don't all necessarily make the most rational decisions, right? Like organizations in particular are implementing different tools just because they're thinking that that's a sort of checkbox, a thing they have to do. I would say that in the lifetime of me being in enterprise IT, myself being in enterprise IT, I've seen this happen over and over again, where there was a time where saying you had VMware implemented was a checkbox on the list of what management expects, right? It was just, you had to do it. There was lots of other virtualization tools. I happen to be a big fan of Hyper-V, even from Hyper-V 1.0, because it ran really, really well on Windows. And for the longest time, it actually ran Linux container or Linux VMs really well. It's just no one ever really talked about that. It was also free with Windows, and VMware was not. So, I was one of those ones that I found a tool that worked. It solved our problems. It was easy for my team to administrate. Hyper-V definitely didn't have all the features at first that VMware did, but VMware was more complicated. We actually tried to implement VMware. This is like 2004, 2005, really early days for virtualization. And it was really hard. We actually struggled to get things to work correctly. There were bugs that we kept finding because it was running on this Linux kernel. We didn't have the Linux expertise in-house to maintain the Linux systems that it was running on, because we were primarily a Windows shop. So for all these reasons, we actually went with what the market probably considered an inferior tool in terms of like looking at some sort of, internet comparison. But it solved our problem so well that we stuck with it for years and years and years. And ultimately, it got replaced, not because it was not doing the job. It's because new management, well, my opinion, new management came in, and on their list of checkboxes was, we have to run VMware. So they told the engineers, this is the tool we're going to be using. We're buying it. You're going to implement it. And ultimately, they might be better off at the end of the day. Who knows? But because not every, sometimes the tool you have is the easiest tool, even though there's might be a better one. So I think that same thing happened with containers, right? Docker when we all started playing with containers, it was a checkbox. Eventually, it was like, okay, we are now running containers. That's a checkbox on now the enterprise to-do list. We must containerize workloads because even if management doesn't understand what containers do or what their real benefits are, they feel like they're being told by the industry, I must do containers. For the longest time, that was Docker. Now I think we're on the orchestration path where it's now the thing to have Kubernetes in your ecosystem because every newspaper, newspaper. I'm so old. Every online website.
Hey, we're live streaming, man. Kubernetes. We're the future.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're going back to paper, in case you didn't know.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so I think that's a largely a checkbox, and so I meet teams. And I'm sure that you talk to the same kind of people all over the place. It's like different strokes for different folks. There's people that are in Swarm that really need to move some of their stuff or all their stuff to Kubernetes because they need that level of orchestration. There are people that need both. They like having both because Swarm is easy and solves problems easy that it can solve. And then there's some problems it doesn't do easy, like jobs, right? Or if you want to specifically run Helm charts for some reason, obviously you can't use Helm charts necessarily out of the box with Docker, although we can talk about a tool that now lets you do that. And so, and then there's people that are on Kubernetes that learn about Swarm and like Swarm for certain things. I've heard of teams that actually quit on Kubernetes and went Swarm. No one ever talks about it, but that does happen on a rare occasion because it is more work than maybe one person has time to do, right? Or two people. So yes, I think definitely there's a future in Swarm. And I think the only thing that I think Docker needs to really improve on is their message about that, right? And I think one of our feedbacks as the captains was that they need to keep getting the word out that Swarm is being supported, it's getting updated. I think someone in chat just said, yeah, there's a Swarm kit commit. There's Swarm kit commits all the time. Swarm kit is the library in Swarm, and it's been getting commits. It never stopped getting commits. And if you look at my blog, I actually put a link in there to my blog called "The Future of Swarm," and the Future of Swarm is an attempt to recap what has happened over the last year in the Swarm kit, in the lib network libraries, all these libraries that basically run behind the scenes. And so, I guess our message right now as a community should be your job, if you're an ops person or if your job is to run orchestration, and not all of us should have the job of running orchestration, but if that is a thing you need and you have to do it, you should probably learn both at some point, because if you only know one or the other, everything looks, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I love that analogy. And if you only have one orchestrator in your tool bag, everything is going to try to be solved with that tool.
Yeah, and I want to, I would make it even harder, that claim saying that Kubernetes to me, and again, I love it. I'm not ranting on Kubernetes, but it's the right tool for the right job, and I sometimes think it's being used as a bazooka to kill a fly. So there's a need by companies and teams to have an orchestration to run containers on multiple servers, or run their application containers on multiple servers, being able to have those applications talk to each other. And Kubernetes has beautiful tooling to do all of that, and monitoring, logging, what we all talked about. But in some cases, that's probably going to be overkill. And Swarm has similar tooling around, has certain things already out of the box that in Kubernetes you have to install other stuff for. Think about secrets. It's like setting up this, what's it called, HashiCorp vaulting, like another beautiful technology, but making it run is really not an easy thing to do. While you set up a Docker Swarm very easily with a couple of commands, like it's set up in a couple of minutes. I even have a YouTube video setting up a Docker Swarm in I don't know how many minutes or seconds even. And you have secret management out of the box, like you can start putting in your database password, API key, stuff like that, just simply in your Docker Swarm, and like the security underneath is airtight, like it's perfectly done for you. You don't have to run anything. So I think there are going to be use cases that will probably revisit, okay, do we really need, or at least I hope, like, do we really need Kubernetes, or should we have picked something simpler? And I think I see that or I have the prediction that some of that or those workloads will probably move to something simpler like Swarm. And I have to say for myself, like setting up a Swarm has taught me way more about distributed system than Kubernetes has, because Kubernetes for me is still somewhat of a black box. Like when certain things go wrong, it's sometimes hard to find, okay, what exactly is happening, and then it's auto healing, so you know everything is going to be fine. But sometimes, like, okay, I don't know what happened, it works again, not going to touch it. While with Swarm, I have the feeling it's less, and also like when there's something wrong, it's easier to pinpoint, okay, it's that server, or it's that master doing something weird, or there's a network partition. Like the issues surface a little bit quicker, or are quicker to find. Kubernetes. Again, it's apples and oranges in a way. Like they're both orchestrators. Sorry, but that's where it ends. And probably not all use cases need Kubernetes and are probably way more suited for Docker Swarm, and maybe also the opposite. But anyway, I think to round up that discussion, Docker Swarm is definitely not dead, and we gave our thumbs up. Like as captains, we hope you keep communicating about Swarm next to Kubernetes, because it's really a beautiful technology, and there are very good use cases for it. So keep working on it. And I think that message was received, and we even gave some direct feedback on things like you just mentioned. Something I really miss in Swarm, and many people with me, I think, is something easy to run jobs, like the idea of cron jobs, but then in a distributed way. Like every Sunday night, I need to send out a bunch of emails or roll up some databases. Something that you can just say, run it on Sunday at 2 a.m. And the beauty of a distributed system is, okay, if one server goes, like if it's a server with a cron job and that server is suddenly down, like your job hasn't run, like giving it to an orchestrator, making it handle a cron job would really solve that issue. And so that's a missing feature that you do have in Kubernetes. Not sure what they're going to do with the feedback, but it seemed they were open to these kind of pieces of feedback.
Yeah, and I think we're going to end up, like, if we look, it's funny how everything in tech is a pendulum, right? And I think right now, the community, especially, or that has been in containers for some time, you know, a lot of us were shifting our energy and excitement from the idea of containers and what Docker means, and like the invention of Docker and how they can make containers really easy. And then because we all learned that, and like, you know, it's not like Docker is adding every 3 months amazing new features to the Docker engine. It's getting stable. You know, the feature pace is slower, and that's just natural of a normal, you know, a normal tool that now it's about to be its 6th year as a living tool. It needs to be stable because we are now building other tools on top of it, like Kubernetes. And I think a lot of us are shifting our energy to the Kubernetes space because it's solving another level of abstraction on top of a single container engine on a single server. And the challenge is that one of the things that, you know, I think gets increasingly talked about lately is, you know, orchestration is hard, harder than a single server. So it's obviously more complex to talk about than just running one app on one server. And Kubernetes was designed by operators for operators. So the funny thing is that I feel like the Docker community was a bunch of developers to start with, right? It was mostly developers, and then slowly us ops people started adopting it. But Kubernetes is the opposite. It was designed by operators for operators, but developers needed something right up front because they were all needing, you know, developers were using Docker, and they were getting away in a lot of ways without needing ops help, because they were able to do their job without depending on operations to build their infrastructure. And then they were looking for an orchestrator, and that orchestrator, the internet tells you, is probably should be Kubernetes. And the challenge is that orchestrator wasn't really written for them. It was written for people with an ops mindset who want lots of flexibility and control. So a lot of times I tell people, if you're brand new to orchestration, especially if you're a developer, learn Swarm. It was designed for developers. Its workflow is specifically designed for developers. That's why it doesn't have all the flexibility and solve all the problems of Kubernetes, because it was really designed initially, and of course its feature set keeps growing, but it was originally designed for web services, things that were long-running tasks, because it doesn't have a jobs engine built in. So long-running things, largely things that were web services, or in other words, things that needed to communicate over a network, because it doesn't have pods, so it can't use like Docker sockets or something, or socket files. It has to use TCP to talk across containers, and there's no sort of concept of talking to another container on the local machine. It has to talk sort of over a distributed network. So anyway, that was how Swarm sort of came out. And on the other end of the spectrum, Kubernetes came out saying, "Hey, look, we're designed on Google's infrastructure on Borg, so we're focused on operations and SRE, and we don't assume anything. We don't assume that you're a web service. We don't assume that you're a multi-server service. We don't assume that you're long running. You have to configure all those things and control all those things, and then we have all these knobs and things to turn to do that." So what's funny is that over time, I think Kubernetes is getting simpler and simpler. We're getting better and better tooling around deploying the infrastructure, managing it, and then on the other side, we've got Swarm adding more and more features. Not as fast as we wished, but it is getting features. Hopefully, it'll get jobs at some point, and they're moving toward each other to where I feel like 3 years from now, I think we're going to end up with orchestrators that look very similar, and there's just going to be different mindsets around how those things are built out. Swarm is sort of, you get everything out of the box. It's not everything, but you can extend it, but you get a lot of the things out of the box. You get built-in networking. It doesn't have a GUI, but the GUIs out there that are so good that I don't know that it needs one anymore. At some point, we actually had Docker's founder actually say he was looking for a GUI for Docker, but I'm not sure that's going to happen given their shift towards enterprise.
Well, there's the Portainer. I don't know what that, like how that project is going, but that was a good UI for a while. It's been a while I heard about it, but
yeah, it's great, and it keeps getting updates. It's not just for Swarm either.
No.
It can do just regular Docker servers. And this summer they got the agents, and that was the best part. Is once they got the agent containers, that way it can manage Docker on each individual server, and they all communicate back to a single one, so that you can then control non-Swarm objects like volumes, non-Swarm networks like local bridge networks, host networks. You can control all that stuff now from the Portainer UI. Totally open source, great project. But yeah, so that's what's happening, right? Is the Swarm getting more and more features, more and more industry support, but it's not growing as fast as Kubernetes, so it gets kind of drowned out by the ecosystem. I don't think anyone needs to promote Kubernetes, because like everyone does, right? It's one of those things where right now, if you're a software vendor, you have to figure out what is your Kubernetes message, because everyone wants to talk about Kubernetes right now, even if they don't necessarily need it. Or I think the number one answer to the question when I ask engineers, why did you pick the orchestrator you're using? The answer is, we were told to do Kubernetes.
yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
And maybe that's the right answer for them. Maybe that is the right path. It's just, I think eventually as we all mature, we'll end up with, we all understand multiple tools, and we know, not everything should be in Terraform. Not everything should be in Ansible, right? Not everything, even though people would disagree, not everything should be in JavaScript.
I think, for instance, like I said earlier, in my team, we used Mesos years ago. It was pre-Swarm, pre-Kubernetes, like early Docker or early container days. Mesos was not purely built for containers. It was just a component you could use. So it was a match made in heaven in the early days.
Yeah, it was just a workload runner, right? Like it could
exactly. Yeah. So I think it started at Twitter, then kind of spun off. But I think what they saw, like at the moment, Kubernetes was, getting really hot in the zeitgeist, and they started feeling, okay, we probably didn't do our marketing well enough to tackle that. they started going for a specific niche, and more playing to the idea of, okay, if you really fine-grained want to tweak CPU, memory, network usage of containers or processes you're running, then that's what you need. And I think, wasn't it even you who shared it? Like, for instance, in telecom, in the telecom world, that's the kind of workloads they're really working with. So Mesos is really huge in that community, and they probably have a bunch of other use cases, maybe in high performance computing, that sort of stuff. And I think, Swarm should, at least the messaging around it should do something not like going for the same group of people, but do something similar. Like, we're the orchestrator for X, and X, I guess, in my opinion, being for simpler solutions, easier to get into, smaller learning curve, stuff like that. It's I think they do a messaging issue, because the tool itself is great. It's just, who is it built for? That's not clear anymore.
Yeah. I'm looking through some of the other questions here, and it's like we've turned the discussion. So there's a typical question about kube versus swarm, and when do you move from swarm to kube? I think that really that's going to be very individual. I mean, if you were someone who started out with swarm and then you hit a problem, like you can't do jobs, or and you can technically use swarm's features to do very simplistic commands and run one-off tasks and stuff like that. But if you need a scheduler system that's like a distributed cron, that's not going to be built out of the box. And people have been using other tools, OpenFAS, OpenJazz, Open Jobs as a Service, other tools to do stuff like that. I still don't think that solves all use cases, and I don't think that Docker ever will solve all use cases for jobs, because quite frankly, there's lots of complexity. There's entire tools in an ecosystem that solve, distributed job management, right? And I'm not sure. I don't know of anyone building that kind of tool on top of Swarm. So what I would expect is that, what I would hope for Swarm to do is for us to work with the Swarm team, and I think we're discussing in here. Suna is in there, one of the other Docker captains. Hello, he's in there talking about a PR and Swarm kit, maybe that we could do a work in progress kind of thing with the Swarm team to figure out exactly. And that's actually already in there. There's multiple issues. I'm not sure if there's actually a PR, but there's multiple issues discussing jobs in Moby and Swarm kit library in their repos, because people have been talking about it for years, and what would go into it, and what should and should not go into the primitives. Because I feel like you could quickly create a very complex solution that is way beyond what Swarm needs. And maybe if we just had the core primitives of running things that are meant to stay around temporarily, that's kind of what batch sets in Kubernetes, job sets? I'm trying to remember. Mine's a blank. Anyway, the type of deployment that you would use in Kubernetes, I don't know why I can't think off the top of my head. It's shameful. It doesn't have necessarily everything you need, but one of the things it does have the concept of is it runs something once, and then it doesn't run it again, and it keeps it around until you delete it. So it keeps the logs and the history of that container running. Maybe someone can remember the name of it. Anyway, it's one of the common ways to deploy containers in Kubernetes. If we had something like that in Swarm, where it was designed to not restart automatically, or reschedule automatically when it shuts down, that kind of thing, then I think that's really all we would probably need. And then someone else could probably build, like Portainer might just throw a simple GUI on top of theirs, or that would then allow you to deploy stuff on there easier than what we have today. So I don't know that we need a fully fleshed out distributed cron batch system.
No.
At least not with 1.0. But I think all this stuff's going to happen, right? And the one thing I want to do to wrap this sort of conversation up is, just like you mentioned a while ago, at the beginning of this conversation, what we heard from Docker was not stuff that they necessarily put out to the community, but I feel like we can say they did say on stage, all of, not necessarily, I don't know if it's all or some of PayPal and Visa's Black Friday infrastructure was all on Swarm. So I don't know how much of it was on Swarm. I'm pretty sure that probably not all of it was on Swarm, but maybe just their websites or something were running in Swarm. So that's a real testament, because a lot of people are looking for real enterprise examples of Swarm working. And I don't know, Black Friday PayPal, like it's got to be up there as one of the top things out there. So that's a good statement of quality, especially considering that a few years ago, Swarm, when it first came out, it had a lot of network performance bugs that you would hit if you were a really big company and you were doing high performance stuff. And so now we have these examples of that working, as well as the fact that, if you think about it, Docker now has over 700 paying enterprise customers. Those people are paying for Docker Enterprise. Docker Enterprise didn't support Kubernetes until this year. And so all of those customers, if they were using it, were using Swarm. And they didn't all just turn on a dime and suddenly leave Swarm for Kubernetes. So one of the things we got from them was, they don't have like exact numbers, but a very high percentage, I'm just going to say 80 or 90% at least, are running Swarm in some fashion, because that's the tool they bought. And now what we're learning is, like, some of the other captains are working at companies that are using Docker Enterprise, and they're leaving some stuff on Swarm and moving other things to Kubernetes. I know two specifically that said that the workloads they're moving to Kubernetes are really just jobs infrastructure stuff, because they needed to do one-off things or things that run on a regular basis, but not always. And they didn't have an easy way to do that in Swarm, so they just did it in Kubernetes.
Yep.
And then they left everything else on Swarm because it worked fine there. So that's an interesting, especially if you have a higher level tool, right? And a lot of people in chat are probably thinking they're going to deploy their own manual Kubernetes clusters. And I usually almost never recommend that. I usually recommend using a higher level tool. Even the people that created Kubernetes don't recommend that. They said that they built Kubernetes for the design of deploying it with higher and managing it and using it with higher level tools. And those higher level tools might be like, EKS on AWS. It might be Docker Enterprise. It might be Rancher. It might be OpenStack. It might be, now DigitalOcean has a Kubernetes offering that you can just sort of, with a couple of clicks, deploy a Kubernetes cluster. And the idea is that those tools build and manage your infrastructure and simply provide you the API to deploy workloads, which is exactly what Swarm does. So it's great to learn Kubernetes and deploy it to learn it, but I think a lot of people are not going to have the time or the knowledge to keep their own custom, what I would call bespoke cluster, secured and monitored and logged properly, because it's a lot of work. I think a friend of ours that's actually another Docker captain who runs a consultancy says he doesn't recommend deploying Kubernetes unless you're at least 3 full-time DevOps people. So in a business that's making money on their infrastructure, right? Obviously, if you're a hobbyist or if you're just learning, that's different. But it's something that people don't talk about a lot, which is maybe you shouldn't do something that's going to create a lot of work for you. We keep hearing about people leaving their clusters on the internet without passwords and keeping them locked down, or not locking them down. And that's a big concern. And I think that happens much more so with people that are deploying it on their own. And getting, they're not maybe getting the RBAC permissions correctly, or they're not locking down their web front ends with proper passwords. Anyway, so that's a risk if you do it yourself, right? So let's shift focus.
Yeah. So I think we made our case for Docker Swarm now. So still alive. As captains, we truly believe in it. It's backed by the knowledge that Docker Enterprise clients are also using it, or at least a large chunk of them. So it's definitely not going away. Kubernetes is another great solution for orchestration. So pick your battles, use the right tool. So on that note, I thought maybe I should dive for a moment in actual announcements that were done at DockerCon, and especially the ones that were on stage. And one, especially in this conversation, is interesting, namely the Compose on Kubernetes one. So the idea, or what they tried to achieve here, and I think it was a component from their enterprise offering that they now open source. So in a nutshell, it's just using Docker Compose files to directly deploy applications on Kubernetes. So based on your Compose file. Let me maybe switch to my screen share so I can give a short little demo. Hopefully it works. Right, can you see my screen, Bret?
Yes, sorry, I clicked mute. Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that should mean that everyone can see it. So it's now an open source repository on GitHub, composed on Kubernetes, which essentially, as a developer or a Kubernetes operator or whatever, really need to know about. It's just the open source component. So the quick demo that I want to give is deploying the voting app. Well-known example app that Docker uses for demos. Well, they have a bunch now, but that was one of the earlier ones. So I'm gonna quickly, for the people who don't know what it's about, show. So it's essentially a distributed application consisting of five applications. So it's a distributed web app, 5 applications. There is a voting front end. You'll see where you can pick between cats and dogs. That pushes votes done by users in a Redis queue. A worker picks up those votes from the Redis queue and pushes them, or stores them in persistent Postgres database. And then there's another front end on that database. That's the result app. It's more for the, let's say, the operators of the poll, of the vote, to see how many people are voting on what. Very simply, 5 applications that all work together, that all have their role in this whole chain of things. There's a compose file, of course, to bring this up, and let me show that in Visual Studio Code over here. So here on the right, make it a little bit bigger. So on the right screen, that's, let's say, the standard, most vanilla way of setting it up on your local machine. So that's a simple Docker Compose file. But now, with this Compose on Kubernetes, you can use the exact same syntax to deploy applications. Now, it's not like an exact drop-in replacement, because as you can see, the Docker file on the left, specifically built for Kubernetes, is a little bit different. So the definition of certain configurations and parts of the applications is a little bit different. But at least it's the syntax that you probably, and especially the developer side of things, are very familiar with, because this is what we use day in and day out. And so this is what we're going to be able to now use to deploy this entire application stack to Compose, to a Kubernetes cluster. So make that smaller. So for my demo, I'm just going to deploy on my local Kubernetes. So if you have a Mac or a Windows machine, out of the box in Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, you have Kubernetes cluster locally installed, a Docker for desktop one. And so in the latest version of that, this whole Compose for Kubernetes is already installed. So you don't have to do anything, essentially, just installing simply Docker for Mac. So that's running there. Now going to my terminal. One way of seeing that you have it available is doing a kubectl API version. Sorry. And then somewhere over here, as you can see, there's compose .docker.com. So this means, this plugin or whatever they call it in the Kubernetes world to run compose stacks is installed on my machine. But again, I didn't have to install anything, just simple Docker for Mac, and it came out of the box. And then I'm gonna deploy, just gonna copy paste the command here. So I'm gonna deploy a stack like you would do on a Docker swarm, like Docker stack based on a compose file. But here in the middle, I'm adding an extra parameter saying, okay, the orchestrator we're going to use here is Kubernetes. And of course, this compose file. So it's a simple stack deploy with one extra parameter. Okay, for some reason...
you got to name your stack.
Oh, yeah. So voting app. That's why we do this, the two of us. Yeah. Okay. So as you can see, a bunch of stuff is going on over here. So you do see that it's using the pod term. So it is the Kubernetes world, stable and running. So that's already a good thing. So as a Kubernetes operator, I can use my standard kubectl command. So get all. This will show me everything that's going on, and yeah, as you can see, there's a bunch of things that are now running, services, pods, stuff like that. So I see here the result app, the Redis queue, the database. Visualizer is something that doesn't really make sense. That's the Docker Swarm visualizer, but in Kubernetes that obviously doesn't work. So I should actually, or it should be removed because I just pulled the example repository, so they should probably just remove that. Anyway, the vote app and then the worker in between. So that's all running. Now the nice thing with this compose plugin is that they also add a new sort of entity to Kubernetes, naming stack. So just as you have pod, services, replica sets, all of that, this plugin adds the concept of a stack, which you can also use over the command line interface. And so through kubectl, I can now see I deployed my voting app stack. So that's cool. But also, so that's the Kubernetes side of things. But I, as a developer, am much more familiar with the whole Docker naming and Docker concepts. So I can just keep using my Docker stack CLI. I do always have to add that orchestrator Kubernetes parameter, of course, but I can just use this and see the exact same thing from a sort of Docker perspective. So that's for the stack that's running and everything. Stack PS. I also have to add voting app here. Yep. Yeah, kind of. I mean, bit visualization is a little bit different, but yeah. So from Docker stack perspective, I can also see the exact same thing. So again, it's what you prefer. Now, just to see that everything is working. It should be 5,000. So this is the voting front end, cats versus dogs, and then same thing on port 5001 is the result backend. So for the operator side of things. So I'm a dog person. So when I click that, my vote is now going through the whole Redis worker database cycle, and then from the result app, you see that my one vote gets 100% to dog. So everything is working. Again, I just had to deploy a stack. So that file was living in that example voting app for a while now. So it's just a simple Docker compose file, no magic, no added things, no. It's just a simple compose file as you would write it in any other way. So This, I think, is a cool new feature to close the gap between Docker and the Kubernetes world even more.
Yeah, I think,
does that make sense?
Especially for those of us that really like the compose workflow. I think a lot of developers especially get their feet wet in Docker with Docker Compose at the Docker command line. And I teach it. I teach that tool because it's so great for local, local management of multiple containers, right? If you're using the Docker raw command line, it can get really tedious. And I'm still not convinced for a developer who's just developing on software that running a local Kubernetes cluster is the right approach. And I see people doing it because they don't have another way to do it, right? They think, I've got my application is going to be deployed into Kubernetes, and I've got my containers, and we don't use two different tools. So instead of a Docker Compose YAML, we just created, our replica sets and deployments in YAML for Kube, and then we deploy that locally when we're wanting to develop. And if you're at all concerned about like performance and battery life and CPU and all that, then you really don't want to run a local Kubernetes cluster, because Kubernetes, that's not, I don't know, and I'm maybe speaking out of turn here, but I don't know that it's within the scope of the Kubernetes project to run efficiently on a laptop, right? It's designed to manage production infrastructure. So it's got lots of containers. If you deploy a kube control, if you do, whether you do the built-in one of Docker deploy or Docker desktop, or you do something like Minikube or something else, you'll notice that there's over a dozen containers running just to run a basic single node Kubernetes machine. So the challenge there is like, wait, are we building out too much infrastructure locally just so that we can develop? And I think that Docker Compose does that great, because it doesn't add any overhead to Docker to make it work, right? It just uses the Docker API. It basically simulates an orchestrator, as far as I'm concerned. And what this tool does, what's really cool for me, is that I can reverse this on its head and say, well, because we're deploying on Kubernetes, instead of me thinking I now need to run kube locally, what if we turn it around and I use Docker Compose locally, and then I can then use that same file in production, so that I'm got similar YAML and configs, so that I'm at least experiencing what's close to production when I'm locally. Because the reality is testing workloads locally has never been testing workloads locally as if they're really running in production has never been a good idea for all of IT, right? We can set up stuff as locally as close to what we think production is, but a local kube machine is only one node. It's not multi-node. So that now you have to worry about, how do I get around with multi-node and service mesh and orchestrate, multi-server networking and all that stuff. So you're never really going to have that locally until you get into your own cloud, your own data center or whatever. So is the right answer, and I think the industry will eventually answer this question, is the right answer that we really need a full cluster orchestrator running locally? It's cool that Docker does it, but I see people that think that that's now their default. They're like, how do I bind mount my local applications into my kube cluster locally so that I can develop on kube locally? And I know you can do it. It's just it seems overly complex if you're just developing a couple of apps, right? You may be going into production in an enterprise environment, but doesn't mean that you need the whole kube system running locally. So I love this because it gets me back to running Docker Compose locally, then handing that YAML off to someone who's going to deploy it on a kube cluster, and then it runs through this API translator in essence. It's pretty cool. Now it's not, I don't know if it's considered beta, because Docker's definitely using it, but it is very limited in terms of what it can and can't do. Like the functionality of a compose file and how that translates to a Kubernetes cluster. There's actually a document. There's an API document.
I saw that, like showing what features are supported and which are not. It's somewhere in the repository.
I'm not sure if it's in Docker app or if it's in the.
I thought it was on the Compose on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Mapping of stack to Kubernetes objects.
There you go. Yeah, you might want to show that for a quick second, because that, I mean, this, we've got a lot of features in Kubernetes. We've got a lot of features in compose files, and they don't always match up one for one. So,
yeah. So screen sharing again. So here's a bunch of things that are supported between Docker Stack and Compose on Kubernetes. That's one thing. And then there's another file. Mapping of stack to Kubernetes objects. Yeah, it's more of a document about what entity you have in the Docker world and in the Docker Swarm world, and how that translates to Kubernetes. So it's not just one-on-one. It's more like, okay, here's a syntax you're familiar with, but you still have to write it for the Kubernetes world, but it does use the same CLI and stuff like that. But so it's, I don't know, it's kind of a way to, I guess, in probably in some cases, in some teams, in some companies, make a bridge between, make the bridge between development and operations a little smaller. Is it very useful? I don't know.
Yeah, it's I think someone in Docker I was talking with said that they didn't know of a lot of people using the compose file to Kubernetes cluster yet. And I think one of those things that is just people don't know about it. And I always, like, I'm an operator who pretends to be a developer, and I work with developers all day. So I've always got my operator hat on, but I'm constantly trying to figure out, how do I make this easier for my developers, right? I mean, that's the DevOps hat. It's like, in the things you do, you need to consider the other team, right? That is on the other side of the wall from you or whatever. And I feel like Compose is like the closest thing that we've seen yet to bridging my local development and testing experience to CI testing to production deployments. And it's far from perfect, but if this gets attention and it gets fleshed out, like, it could be a really cool thing. And of course, CNAB, I don't know if this is going to be affected by CNAB. Maybe the CNAB standard will cause these tools to use that standard. I'm not even sure if that's a thing that should be considered, because I still don't quite understand exactly the scope of the CNAB spec. So that takes us a segue to Docker app.
Let's dive into that, because that's what I wanted to end with, indeed. And I'll do another very quick screen share, no demo or anything, because it is indeed still a little bit weird as to where this project is going or what's expected from the community. But so one of their, let's say, big announcements at, I think, the second day of the keynote, the very end. It's a project a bit co-hosted by Docker and Microsoft, or at least they both worked closely on this together. Very high level, probably cutting a lot of corners by saying this, but the idea would be to bring all or bring a bunch of tooling configuration files together in one. So I have this other tab open, probably a very well-known cartoon about standards and companies, entities that always want to come with the de facto standard, and they just created one more. So they specifically said that's not what they want to do with CNAB. So CNAB stands for Cloud Native Application Bundle. The idea would be more of an umbrella kind of specification. So if you, let's say today, in your company, you use Ansible and you use Terraform, or you use CloudFormation and some other stuff, you don't have to throw that away. Like, those things, can still exist and should exist. What CNAB tries to do is package that all together. So well, we joked about it. Anyway, I took some screenshots from during the keynote, from the presentation. So what one of the presenters said was, well, we're so over in our head right now with distributed applications or orchestrators and how to operate and run all of that, but we seem to lose sight of the applications itself. Like it's all about it's Kubernetes, monitoring, tracing, and service meshes and all that stuff, but we're losing the idea, or at least that's what he said, we're losing sight on what actually matters, being the applications and people using our applications that don't give a crap about how we run our things. Like the application is what users interact with, and that's what we should put our focus on. Anyway, it's a way of looking at things, not my opinion. So what they essentially try to, the higher level issue they try to solve is kind of this. And we joked about it, like they call WordPress the hello world application of the distributed world. And so in this diagram, in this example, there's a couple of components at work. So let's say you want to install a WordPress application or a WordPress website into Azure. Well, it was Microsoft. So Azure is what they wanted to pitch here. Let's say you have a Cloudflare DNS in front of that. You run some stuff in Kubernetes, and you have a database. Like those are all, or in this case, those are three kind of different components that have their own configuration language, configuration tool. Cloudflare has an API. Your application containers themselves, you want to probably deploy them with Helm, and you want a persistent database. So that is something you do with Azure templates, or in the AWS world would be a CloudFormation, or if you want to do it more agnostic, it's Terraform. So there's essentially three types of different, or three sorts of configurations needed just to put one simple WordPress application in production. So that's the problem space, and I think I have one more slide. And okay, it's a bit of a jokingly said, but in a way, this should be the experience from a developer point of view. Again, not my opinion, but I do see where they're trying to go, like make things much more easier. Like a distributed application should be as easy as having a what you like a GUI installer where you just click install and it does all the things under the hood for you. That's their vision on everything. So that's where this idea stems from. So let's maybe spend a couple more minutes now actually discussing what we think, or where this should be going, because it's still all pretty vague. Like it's a specification, so it's not, CNAB is not really a tool yet. It's something software vendors with the likes of Azure, AWS, HashiCorp, Terraform, like all these vendors should be implementing against, I guess. What's your vision on this?
I feel like we need more examples of exactly what the end user tools would look like. And Docker app is their current example, but and then this other tool that I don't quite even understand. But I feel like we need a few other tools that are more infrastructure plus app, because Docker app itself is really only controlling Docker or Kubernetes, so it's not it's not like, the way I look at this tool is that the pitch to me is that eventually I will have one tool that replaces multiple tools. And at this point, honestly, most of us, that's all we should be interested in, because our entire tool bag is full of a bunch of tools we have to solve problems. And as DevOps or ops people, that's because that's what the CNAB seems to be, is a more DevOpsy, ops oriented tool. It's not to help you with development. It's to help you with managing infrastructure, deploying apps on infrastructure. at the end of the day, it might just say deploying apps. That's the only thing we care about. But really, it's the hard part is dealing with your app on different infrastructures, right? That's sort of the rub of what we have now. It's like, okay, I have container images, but deploying it on every single type of infrastructure requires completely different tools every single time. And, you know, a lot of us would say, well, we have you know, obviously we have things like CloudFormation for AWS and various YAML specifications and whatnot and tools for each type of infrastructure. You know, you might even say Heroku. We have a Heroku file config or Heroku YAML that helps us deploy our app there. And if you're, I mean, just everybody has that, right? But then you look at Terraform, and possibly you might consider Ansible in there too. But Terraform is designed to use the same commands to deploy infrastructure across one or many different infrastructures, but it doesn't necessarily deploy your app. As that's not what, you know, it may be able to do that. You can make it do that, but it's not necessarily scoped to do that. And at least in my opinion. So I guess this tool is now a superset of that potentially could have, or it's a standard, right? Because it's not a tool, but we can end up with a tool that uses that to allow you to control multiple parts of your tooling. So I as an implementer, I'm looking at this and saying, I want to see an example of a tool that replaces, you know, 2 or 3 different tools that I can use from the command line, and it solves all those things. And maybe that example exists and I'm just not seeing it.
Yeah, me neither. No,
because they're GUI.
So there's one blog post written by Gareth from Docker, who worked on this project together with Microsoft, I guess. And somewhere in that post, he mentions the fact, like, is this going to be important for you? And then has two use case or two contexts. Like, if you're a software vendor, ideally, yes, you should be joining this effort. If you're just a user, not yet. It's more of a future. And then and that's probably the majority of people that touch this thing right now, just like we do. Like, we want to know as users, what's this going to mean for us? And he gave the example of OCI, which is the Open Container Initiative, I guess, which is also a spec. He says, as a user, that's probably something you've never even read or implemented against or even touched. But under the hood, it has given software vendors and tooling vendors the opportunity to all work with or against a shared spec, and that has made the tooling so much better and made it so that everything works way better together. So as an end user, you're probably not going to interface with this thing directly, but under the hood, you'll see that the tooling built all around of the container ecosystem works better together. So we're all going to get better out of this, at least if software vendors develop against it. So that's still pretty vague and high level, but at least their effort is to indeed be a superset and to kind of bring all the tooling that currently exists better together.
Yeah,
that's
I think we're going to need to see some of the experimenters play around with some stuff, and maybe see if Microsoft or one of the other vendors can come up with a more concrete end-to-end example to really understand the power of potentially of what this could do for everyone. Because obviously someone could just create a tool that, you know, this is the tool that lets you deploy, you know, and I'm sure that honestly, there's probably a couple of tools that already do a lot of this stuff in the Kubernetes ecosystem. They're just not written on standard formats. It's a very probably proprietary front end that says, here's how to deploy, automatically use the same command line to, you know, build up your infrastructure, build up the Kubernetes cluster, and then deploy all your apps in one command line, you know, or whatever. And those probably exist. Knowing the excitement around Kubernetes and the potential for making our jobs easier, there's so many tools launched, you know, so often that it's just impossible for any one person to keep up with them all. So the example that Docker gives is the Docker app tool now works on this standard, and I can actually show it off for a couple of seconds if you want to.
Yeah, sure.
It's an example. I don't think I can share screen. Do you have to give me? Oh, wait, maybe I can. Screen share.
Yeah, the greenish button.
Yeah, I got it. Yep. The menu keeps hiding it. I wish the menu wasn't hiding. So yeah. Oh, where'd it go? Okay, so I have a couple of examples that I actually did at DockerCon where, and they're the examples now, because I'm more ops focused than dev focused, I'm going to show some of that stuff, and I won't show all the things that Docker app can do. So in case you're curious, you can just go to, I think, github.com/docker/app. And that's where this, and you have to download this binary. So it's docker-app, right? And then you get the help just like you would with Docker Compose or the Docker command line. But what I've done here in this directory is I have a bunch of Docker Compose or stack file YAMLs that you could deploy to those. Just seeing the Docker, the Compose to Kubernetes example that we did a while ago, we can use those YAMLs to deploy to Swarm or Kubernetes. But if I choose to use the Docker app command line, I get more functionality than just to deploy. I actually, well, it's right here. There's a list of command options, and the ones that I gave it in my talk at DockerCon was around this deployment, which this basically replaces Docker stack deploy. And in fact, I don't even think it needs Docker to be installed on the machine you're running this, because it talks to either Swarm endpoints or Kubernetes endpoints and deploys just like stack deploy would, but it does it itself, and it's all built into its API. It's not its client API. It doesn't need the Docker client API. And then what's the other one? The push is very interesting as well. So what I did in this directory was let's look at this one. I have the stack voting YAML. So this is a very standard, like just the example you were using, the voting app in a standard YAML file. So if I just take a look at that for a second. So you can see it's the standard Compose YAML that we've all seen before, right? There's it defines your images, defines your network, stuff like that. And that works with Docker stack deploy. But one of the challenges around these YAML files for operating teams or DevOps teams is, just like I version my images and I version my code, I also need to version my deployments so that I know which one I've deployed, so I can deploy the exact same thing multiple times maybe. And you don't really have that. There is no such thing as a version of a YAML yet for Docker Compose. So Docker app does that. And so one of the commands it can do can spit out these new files that you'll see. And so I have one here. So the voting.docker app is this basically a replacement for the stack file or the Compose file here. And it looks very similar. If I just actually, and I'm going to lose YAML formatting. Let's see. Yeah, it's no prettier here. Are you still in your meeting? Okay. So in this file at the very top, what you'll see is the Docker app command adds in new stuff. And this is basically metadata about this file, including the version of this different YAML. So I can hard code image versions in here and then version this thing. I can give a description. I give the maintainer of it. So these are things that we could do with Docker images, but we didn't have for the YAML files in terms of deployment. So what we've always had to do in the past is we basically keep all of our YAMLs in a GitHub repo or something, and then the commits or the releases that you do inside of Git. So they're Git-based versioning instead of file-based versioning or image-based versioning. And that has pros and cons, right? So now what we can do here is I can specify the version of this YAML file. And of course, that's not related to the schema version, which is this version down here. This is the schema version. And then this up here is the version of the Docker app. And so I can now work in a team where this file, if I change it, I can manually increment the version if I want to. And the reason that I might do that is that I can now do a Docker push, a Docker app push with this file. And if I were to do that, and it takes all the defaults, and it will wrap up this Docker app YAML in an image of its own, not with none of the apps in it, just this particular YAML. It will then give it an image version, an image tag rather, and then it will push that to my registry. So in this case, it would be pushing it to Docker Hub. And it uses all the defaults from that file. So I look at that again, you'll notice that there is the namespace dog versus cat, which in the term of a registry, that means it is the organization. So if I have an organization called dog versus cat, and this image name would be called voting, or this file would be called voting. So I would expect it to show up now in Docker Hub as voting.dockerapp. And in fact, you can now see that because they just released this brand new UI for Docker Hub. They updated the Docker Hub UI. And let me...
Yeah, right. That was, I think, something they should have shown at DockerCon and didn't. It only came out a week later, so deadlines probably. But anyway.
It's like they must have... I wouldn't be surprised if they meant for it to be released at DockerCon, but the team was probably at DockerCon and didn't want to deal with like any support. You know, how would you release a new major version? All right, so one of the things you'll notice here, actually, if I go to this organization, dog versus cat, I have now this voting Docker app. So these files are not images of apps; they're images of YAML. So they still use the image format, but inside them is a YAML file, and they at least now show up. So if I use Docker app now, I can do something called Docker app deploy, just like you can do a Docker stack deploy, but instead of me deploying a local YAML file, I can deploy an image from my registry that uses that YAML file in it, which means ultimately at high level, for years, people have said two things. Could we have a Docker Hub for compose files? This is that. This is the answer to that problem. The second thing I get is we make software and we put our images on Docker Hub for people to use, but we would like to give them a YAML file that they can deploy very easily of our software in its proper configuration. And until now, the only answer to that was, well, go over to our GitHub repo or read the README and cut and paste. And those answers always assumed that one, your user knew what GitHub was. Maybe they're just, maybe they're just an end user and they just want to run, WordPress, and they need a sample WordPress setup from the WordPress team. And now we can do that. We can now have a separate repo underneath, the WordPress organization, and it could just be called WordPress.dockerapp. And now you can use Docker app deploy, so as a one-liner, to deploy both the WordPress and then the backend MySQL. Maybe it's even a fancy one and it has like a varnished front end in front of it or something. And you can do all that in a one-liner so that your regular users don't need to know everything about the inside of YAMLs and how to make them just to set up a sample infrastructure. So this takes me back to like 15 years ago when I used to do like Linux. You'd rent a little part of a Linux server and they would have that thing called cPanel. And you might, you might have on there like a WordPress one-click install that will deploy your blog and your database all in one shot. Well, this is now that from the command line. This allows us to deploy any app on any number of containers, so any solution with a one-liner, and have that image and have it a versioned image of the specification in a registry somewhere on the internet that everybody can get to. So when I show that demo, I feel like, okay, this makes sense. People get that this now is better than saying, go clone my repo and get the YAML file and then change it and then run Docker stack deploy, but only against Swarm. It gets really complicated when you start going down that road. And I think this makes it simpler.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think indeed this is, and this under the hood, at least what they say is using the, or building it or writing against the CNAB spec already. So it's these kind of efforts that they hope to see more in other tooling that kind of brings things together in a simple packaged way. So it's almost just clicking like in that GUI, like clicking on install and everything gets installed for you, and not just here's the image and then copy paste a bunch of Docker commands with some settings inside and stuff like that. No, this is just more of a one click or one command kind of thing.
Yeah, and of course, Docker app itself actually does way more than that, and it allows you to actually extract out your environment variables and do other stuff. It you use Helm charts, so you can actually use Helm charts in this example without using compose file or stack files, but or and again, I think in outputs to Helm charts, so that you can take your compose file and turn it into a Helm. But anyway, that's way beyond what we're trying to show in this talk, which we've almost been going for 2 hours. So we should probably wrap up.
Yeah, indeed.
But this has been good. Any last thoughts? DockerCon. What are we looking forward to next year? Do you have a wish list?
Yeah, Moby Cool hacks. I think the effort of the and non-enterprise related things, they should a bit like you have at AWS reInvent, I guess. They typically have one keynote day that is very enterprisey, where Andrew Jassy does his thing, and then the next day is much more technical under the hood with Werner Vogels, much more catered to developers, operators, much less for business people. So that balance, I think, is something Docker is probably looking for, and they should aim for. So one day where it's all about business enterprises and how they can win from using Docker and Docker for Enterprise, and then another day that is purely on things that happen under the hood, open source projects, stuff like that. That's really what I'm looking for.
Yeah, some of the old stuff that we lost, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
More of the community stuff. And I think, so one thing we have to remember is DockerCon Europe is actually shorter than DockerCon US.
Yeah.
And DockerCon US is also almost twice as, or I'd say it's over twice as big as EU. So I think, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I get a feeling sometimes that not all the things that we do at DockerCon US can fit in the EU format. So although we have been doing Moby hacks in EU before, so that's certainly something that they could fit in if they wanted to. It also could be maybe that there wasn't any really cool submissions of Moby hacks.
Yeah, who knows?
Maybe we're, the things that we were doing with containers in the first 3 and 4 years are all sort of, if you look back on those examples from 3 years ago, we're all like, oh yes, that was neat, but everybody does that now. That's normal. So maybe it's going to have to be more than just a Docker, because really at the time, it was really just Docker engine hacks. It was like, what do I use the Docker engine for that's interesting? I can use it on a quadcopter to replace the firmware, or I can use it on a rocket that I shoot in space. But then, like we thought what was weird is last year at San Francisco was some of the hacks seemed to have really very little to do with Docker itself, like the engine. So to me, Docker app is a cool hack, but it's made by Docker, so it's probably not qualifying for a Moby hack. Because Moby hacks are designed to be about the community. So maybe someone can do something really creative with Swarm, like implement jobs on top of Swarm without needing the Swarm's API.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or deploying a Swarm. Like Jeff, one of the Docker captains, has created some stuff that allows you to deploy swarms with Kubernetes. So Kubernetes acts as the sort of the jobs engine that will then deploy little swarms for you in an automated way, because really with the CRDs and the things in Kubernetes, it does more than just deploy apps for long-running services on servers now. I mean, it always has. It's always been a larger toolkit that can do many things. But anyway, yeah, I think that I'm excited for DockerCon next year because I'm hoping that we'll see some new things in Swarm, because I know that they've done some hiring, and really this last year has been them just making sure that everything works well with Kubernetes, and I feel like they've got their foothold on that. So hopefully we'll have a renewed focus on some much needed features, or much requested features, I guess, of Swarm, because I know that certainly a lot of their customers care, and a lot of the captains in the community care as well about that product. And we definitely don't want to see it die on the vine, so to speak. So I just wish I was a good enough Go developer to make some PRs, because I'm not. So I'm not that person.
All right.
I have lots of ideas
note,
to help you implement them.
On that note, yeah, so not a good Go developer, but you're an excellent teacher, especially in DevOps, Docker Swarm, soon Kubernetes and Node.js, I think. So maybe quick plug for your the things you're doing before we end.
Thanks. I'm actually typing it in the chat so that you don't have to try to figure out how to spell my name. Yeah, so shameless plug, I do make courses on the internet, and this is now like my full-time gig, is teaching people in both live workshops and on the internet, as well as doing a little bit of consulting. But most of the time now I'm focused on helping you, the listener, implement container tooling. And it started with Docker, and I have dockermastery.com is my most popular course. We just broke, I think, like 83, we might even be up to 84,000 students. So that's going very well. We're about to come up on, we're about 3 months away from having a 2-year anniversary of the course. And so it'll be getting an update here soon with some new videos in 2019. And then I followed that on with a Swarm Mastery course. Both of these courses are at the link that I just put in chat. That's bretfisher.com/Docker. And so the coupons are there. You can get those courses if you don't already have them. I'm sure lots of people in the chat, I see familiar names and faces. So those are definitely students from the course and the community that we've built around that. We have a whole community of weekly live AMAs, and we have a Slack channel where people discuss containers and Docker all week long. And then I'm now working on a Docker for Node.js course. So I'm a little bit better at Node than I am at Go. So I thought I would make a course around how to do the best Node in containers, and how to get all the features and bells and whistles of Docker and Docker Compose and all the things with Node. So that'll be coming out here very quickly. And then finally, I'll be working on a Kubernetes course. And so you can see sort of we started at 101 and we're working our way up the stack of tooling. And I'm sure you will see some of Nils in the future, because he's such a great Docker supporter and community leader that he's going to be on some of my Q&As, and he doesn't know about that, but I'm just volunteering for that.
Okay.
So we're going to start having guests, I think, on my weekly Q&As, and it's not quite a podcast, but it's kind of turning into that. So I'm also looking at ways to get that in some sort of podcast format so people can listen in and talk about stuff. So what's more fun than just hanging out and recording yourself forever on the internet and then putting it in an audio book?
Exactly what we're doing.
So yeah, you can get my courses all at that link. All the coupons are there.
I'll put them in the description also. So,
and
all right,
that's it.
Cool. Thank you very much, man, for a little over 2 hours talking about just DockerCon. I think a bunch of interesting stuff to be checked out. I'll put some extra information in the description. And I guess, I'll see you next time.
Yeah, either on your channel or mine. Somewhere here on the internet, probably on YouTube.
All right. Thanks, man.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.